Okay, so I'm gonna be presenting some flyers that I made. These are kind of referred to in some different ways. I'm calling them the colorful flyers for our presentation. They're bright colors, and so they're sort of easily recognizable and sort of kind of memorable in that way. But I want to present them today not as these perfect things, but as sort of like useful tools to present to students, but also like to use for like self-reflection and as reference points. So I'm going to demonstrate a lot of different ways we can use these tools and not just present the content of them. So as I go through them, I'm going to sort of just be kind of go off of a sort of pedagogical fervor and just kind of get into brainstorming a lot of different things that come to my mind. So as I'm talking about them, that's maybe something other people could do as well. And, you know, at the end, we'll have some time where you can ask me questions, but also maybe we could share some other ideas that people have listening about, you know, ideas they came up with how to use them. So again, like they're going to be colored. And so maybe like remembering which color one you're sort of thinking about can also be part of asking a questions at the end. So just to mention some things before we look at these, the idea behind them is sort of modeled off of, like you might have seen in like a college bookstore, these sort of like cheat sheets that you put like inside your binder, and it's got like all the basics of biology or algebra or Spanish. They'll have them for French or whatever. And the idea behind those is sort of, yeah, that there's like a cheat sheet that you can look back at, but it also is like, you know, a helpful thing to make sure that you, if you really are serious about learning Spanish, to memorize that, right? That there's nothing that should be on that cheat sheet you don't eventually like know really, really well. Even if you still use that cheat sheet to go back and like see that list of verbs that are irregular in this tense or this structure of that sentence. So making something that's really referenceable like that and is not a kind of specifically not like a paragraph, right? It's not an article. It's something different, but it's still, you know, it's using language, but in a different sort of a design, a different layout for a different function. And so another thing to kind of think about with this is again, like I'm a language teacher. I teach French and Spanish, and when you teach language, you can kind of just pick up any textbook and they're all going to have sort of the same faults. And that makes it a little bit irrelevant how great one of them is, because they're going to have limitations real immediately, but they're all going to serve as just a huge bank of example sentences and kind of a list of stuff that like you're going to need to go through at some point, or that you're likely to see whether you want to see or not. And the idea being that like we can definitely evaluate textbooks, you know, as a teacher, as a professor. Like I've worked with lots of different French textbooks. I've worked with departments to like, you know, decide which textbooks to choose. But all of those things, they're more or less just using the same language examples from the textbook. The point of the book in real practice is to use it as just samples of French that's already there, so that we can take those samples, we can modify them, we can transform them, we can maybe elaborate on them. And so it's a lot about having a kind of bank. And so that's another sort of reference point for the motivation or the model behind these flyers. So then some of the objectives or some of the things about these flyers is also that they're objects for learning. They're not bylaws for an organization. They're not like authorities on anything. They're also not persuasive documents or arguments necessarily. But they have to be something. And what I've kind of learned in making these and in making other learning resources specifically about radical politics revolutionary politics, is that a lot of times you can get pushback from people with political opinions that want to argue with learning resources as if they are political arguments. And it leaves very little space to make resources that are specifically for people to form those arguments, that are not attempting to prevent those arguments from happening, but how can people prepare themselves to make those arguments and to participate in that dialogue? And so I'm interested in the ways that educators are actually taking a political stance in making things that have political content, but are not, again, like they're not trying to serve as a rallying point for an organization. They're tools for learning, and that there's a different function there. It doesn't mean those things can't overlap, that they're not related, but that there's a different function in making something like a list of sentences in French that we can learn French with, versus writing bylaws for an organization, or making some polemic arguments. So then some other things about these is definitely that the flyers themselves are meant to be read and reread, not just kind of read through and seen. And that's another thing to explore, again, because these are not articles or essays, the idea that you could kind of study and restudy and like stay on them and like go back to them. They're meant to be modified, to be discussed and analyzed, critiqued, even to be overcome, because the point is that they're not exhaustive. And that again goes back to like the point about making learning resources, because these learning resources are not, they're not meant to cover everything. They're not meant to be perfect and like have thought of every single bullet point to put on there. They're meant to be some bullet points to make you think of more bullet points, to make you think of like what isn't included, or how you could summarize all those bullet points into this like articulate way of relaying that to other people, how you could refine it more, or the opposite, maybe how you could elaborate on it more. So the point of them not being exhaustive is actually really important and is different from making a kind of, again, like organizational document, a platform, or an explicit strategy for a political organization. Making learning tools is about making kind of dead objects that can be revisited. And so that's a real important aspect of these flyers, is that they're kind of just there. And even in kind of thinking about how to make this presentation, like I've sort of shared these flyers with so many individuals and just with different people over the last several months since I made them. And I kind of, all the different like conversations and stuff very much blur together. And I had this desire, to present like different points that I've heard people make about them, or things that have come up in those conversations. And I think that in preparing, I kind of decided that actually it's a little bit better to go off of right now and just encounter them again, because that's actually the whole point, is that I don't know the most about them. The point is to put some stuff on the page so I could revisit those things, so that I could even create some distance from the points themselves in order to come back to them, form new opinions with different perspective. So there's a kind of distancing yourself from the object you want to learn about, which is actually really important. And so yeah, some thinking of these as cheat sheets, textbooks, and limited things to use by overcoming in practice that are not exhaustive. Some sort of just different ideas that I've wanted to point out before I start presenting them is, first, that they're like reference tools, so you can come back to them. Second idea is that they're starters. They might be starters for conversation, for a writing, for even just other things to go study, right? Starters for other things to go look up and research. They can be sources for terms to like look into more. or ideas to go find out more about. They can also be like not just starters for writings, but also maybe guideposts for them, so that you kind of have some, oh, I want to talk about, you know, all 3 of those bullet points or something. It can be a way of keeping the discourse of a writing on track and kind of sharpened, because it's not necessarily the outline for your writing, but again, it's a kind of guidepost. It lets you know like where you are in relation to this larger point. And they're shareable with beginners. This is important, like someone who doesn't know a lot about politics or revolutionary politics in particular. These are not, you know, over anyone's head, in a sense that like they're meant to be sat with for a while. And, you know, the same bullet point read and then like kind of reading some other parts and going back. And it's something that's supposed to produce questions. And so there's in no way a target for these that is specifically like more advanced or more experienced people or militants or organizers versus people who are beginners. So in that way, they're also an object that doesn't create a hierarchy of experience or knowledge. They're kind of common terrain in that way for learning. Like I said before, they're not essays or articles, which is actually like really important, not because essays and articles are bad or problematic, but I think that it can sometimes be hard to apply the same sorts of like rereading and reapproaching and like kind of re-referencing from paragraphs. It can be a lot more difficult to pick stuff out and like revisit. It takes a lot more nuanced approach to reading. And with the design of these and with the design of again, like cheat sheets and textbooks and stuff like that, the idea is not just that like the paragraphs matter. It's also kind of like how you can relate that paragraph to something else that's like on the page juxtaposed in a certain way. Ways of refining and summarizing things and setting things off. So those are all related. And then also that like these are not just for discussion, but also again for reflection, that they're helpful just for you individually to go back through and revisit and, you know, re-relate to. That's an important part of it. So let me get into presenting these. So like I said, I'm gonna just go through each one individually and we're gonna read them, and I'll just kind of like I said, riff off of some different things I think about that might be helpful from my perspective, sort of brainstorming about what to do with people learning these, what I might do with myself. And again, people can come up with ideas they maybe have as well. And at the end, we'll have some time and we can share those. So the first one that we have here is radical political critiques. And we can see there's 5 different categories here. There's tactical, strategic, revolutionary, ideological, and theoretical. And inside of each critique, there are some bullet points here that list some things related to that critique. And we also have on the right a little quotation. And the quotation sort of serves again as a way to like distinguish one category of critique from another one. This is the idea with a tool like this is that it can help you figure out how to describe and elaborate on a critique you already have. It can help you learn how to categorize it and figure out some other details or ways of articulating it and expressing it. And that's part of the idea with the quotation. So if we look at tactical, I don't agree with this action and how it's being carried out. So some things around a tactical critique could be that there's not enough unity. There's not a clear objective. There's insufficient instructions, insufficient support, authoritative leadership, individualistic participants. And so all of these things, there could obviously be some more things that you might have critiques about tactically, but you can see how they kind of need to fit into this framework. And that we can start to understand tactical by looking at the next category. So going from, I don't agree with this action and how it's being carried out, to I don't agree with the direction this is going. So strategic is like a no common goal, isolated actions, insufficient time for reflection and discussion. It's too dependent on the vision of leaders, and it's not considering the consequences. So it's not just simply about giving a definition of a tactical critique or giving a definition of a strategic critique. You need to kind of find how to locate what you're thinking, right? You need to find how to articulate your critique around it and understand how maybe you have a tactical and a strategic critique. Being able to distinguish them from each other and make them both more explicit is a way of participating politically. So looking at revolutionary, this is the quotes, I don't agree that this will help to bring about revolution. So instead of just about the action or about the direction, here we have that it's not going to bring about revolution. It's no threat to power. There's no power building, no long-term vision, only superficial change, insufficiently committed participation, unengaged populace or community. We can see how, like, in addition to just adding another point on here or taking one off, saying like, I don't think that only superficial change is a part of a revolutionary critique. That's an okay thing to say, but also like maybe it's superficial is a word that's problematic, and I wouldn't say only superficial change. I'd say this other thing instead. That there's a way to like again, like I said before, with making learning tools, you have to pick some words to put on the page, and that means that like they're again we've made this kind of dead thing. And now it's just there for people to have opinions about, and that's the whole point. And that's not nothing. It actually takes some political courage, I would even say, to just pick some words and actually finalize the thing. Because it can turn into this endless draft if it's trying to be something that's not a learning tool. So looking at the ideological versus the revolutionary, this is, I don't agree with the principles behind what is happening. With the principles. So it's not egalitarian, oppressive, abusive, exploitative, or dominating. It's authoritarian, like against freedom. It's representative, like a faux democracy. It's in favor of capital and or the state. Again, like there could be other things to add on to this, but sort of as you come up with more examples, trying to see like, does that fit into one of these categories or not? That is an exercise. It's not about how perfect this document is. It is the exercise of saying like, well, what about this example that I see in real life, or that I can come up with, or that I know someone who experiences? Where does that fit in? When I hear this critique from someone else, how do I understand their critique, right? If it's from a different ideological tendency, maybe they have totally different things that they would put on their list, but understanding that they're making an ideological critique, that they don't agree with the principles behind what is happening, that can itself be an important exercise. Not just in understanding, but also studying other people's perspectives and refining your own. So then the last one here, I don't agree with the connections that are being made between the different parts. It might be ignoring a dominated class, overlooking a dominating class, forgetting the present situation, omitting certain goals, values, plans, etc., drawing dubious conclusions, discounting the whole, oversimplifying. So another thing that these can be used for is, I'm not going through this stuff and explaining the content here. But that could be a whole presentation in itself, right? Just going through these and going into detail about each one of these bullet points and why that's important and why it needs to be on this list, and what the values are behind it, what the thinking is behind it, anecdotes are related to it. And so again, I'm wanting to present these as tools that can be used in future spaces, or to be inspiration for tools you can make to use in other spaces. Okay, so looking at the next one, this is an introduction to libertarian socialism. We can tell that the layout is very different. And we're going to read this one from the top. And again, I will sort of point out some things that come to mind as I read through it. So we start off with a question, what is it? And we have an A and a B here. So A, socialism without the state. B is collectivized property. So we have 2 points to this. What is it? And again, this is about being didactic and clear. It's not about being exhaustive. Because if we just try to make, oh, actually there should be, 13 points on this, that becomes something that's unwieldy. And that it becomes something that's trying to accomplish a sort of perfection as it's encountered by other people. And part of making a tool is that we don't know what anyone's going to do with it. If we think of making a hammer, you don't know what someone's going to build with the hammer. That's not part of making a good hammer, is being prescriptive of what to build with it. So we have 2 points here. What is it? Socialism without the state. And there's 2 points inside of this. An egalitarian society of self-managers, eliminating the privileges of the upper classes. So kind of like going backwards, there could be an exercise in just picking out words and discussing how they work. Like upper classes, that implies lower classes. What are the differences? Are there synonyms for classes? What are examples of privileges? Are those privileges that the upper classes have? Or are those privileges that some other classes have? Again, looking at like an egalitarian society. What's the difference between an egalitarian society and another adjective we could put on there? What are examples of other adjectives we could put on there? What makes an egalitarian society different than some other kind of society? So even just on the word level, exploring how, okay, egalitarian, that's one kind of modifier for society. What's another one, right? And comparing them, why are they different? What's important about this one and how's it related to socialism? This document doesn't answer those questions, but again, it can be a guidepost. It can be a place to start. Collectivized property, this is workers and consumers making decisions themselves, meeting everyone's needs, ending capitalist exploitation. So again, working from the back up, we're seeing it's ending exploitation, a certain kind of exploitation, right? Capitalist exploitation. Meeting everyone's needs. We could definitely explore like, what are these needs? What are examples of them? You could ask like, how could it meet those? Maybe some of exploring and interacting with these documents is about creating a kind of articulated skepticism, an actually articulated critique, not a vague sort of like, oh, that's not what I think. Instead, like having a real thing to respond to. And so the guidepost works like that as well. Workers and consumers making decisions themselves. This could definitely be something that's like, maybe there need to be more things on this list. Workers and consumers, and maybe there's a reason for someone to consider the relationship between those not as equal as I'm presenting it here. Collectivized property. Maybe that's not the term someone would want to put on there. Again, playing with the words is really important with these kinds of documents. And it's something that you can't necessarily do outside of a debating space without something explicitly for learning. So then another question, because we started with the question, what is it? Now the question, why is it so abstract and theoretical? We have to imagine the future we want because capitalism can't be allowed to have a monopoly on the imaginary. And then we have another point here. Remember, our longest term objectives inform our most immediate actions. So to point out the layout here, this is important the way this is kind of set aside. It's kind of an easy point to get back to. The remember is even another like easier point to get back to inside of that. Thinking about accessibility, not just instantly, but in the future, the ability to revisit it. And it's why these are not just paragraphs, again, because paragraphs are not necessarily the easiest thing to revisit. They require a kind of linearity of experiencing them that the flyers don't demand. You can jump straight at this one box, right? Why is it so abstract? Or maybe you scroll through the questions and you see which question is it that's answering what I'm asking. And then here, another question, what about modern technology? It must be used to improve society, the environment, and the quality of life. Should benefit workers, consumers, and those in need. Can reduce the number of hours people have to work without compromising society's production and distribution needs. So here, obviously, we could make more lists of things to add here, but maybe there's another exercise that could be going on as well, where when we see bullet points, we summarize them. You try to figure out like, okay, what do all these have in common, right? How can we characterize all of these with kind of one way of expressing that to other people? So, I mean, with these, just for example, like they're not negative opinions of the term technology, right? Maybe there's an aspect of that, and it's not in the individual examples. It's in us kind of seeing like, okay, why do these have to do with each other? And then again, like, why do they have to do with what it is? And why do they have to do with an introduction to this? This idea that like every time we have a question, there's maybe a reason to look through the document some more, scroll around with your eyes and find it again and like revisit parts you just looked at. Because remember, our longest term objectives inform our most immediate actions. This kind of like the document itself is like echoing itself. So then the bottom here, some key points. So like the remember, key points. It's like a thing like, oh, well, remember this stuff. Again, this cheat sheet idea. Libertarian socialism is democratic and anti-authoritarian. 2, it is not utopian or idealistic. 3, it is the end of capitalism, but it is not the harmonious end of all conflict and domination. 4, it is a long-term objective for the construction of a future society. And so these key points, again, can be maybe things that people find problematic and are things to respond to. In responding and articulating your opinion, maybe you make a whole different document, right? Maybe you make a different tool that people can learn with that fixes the problem with this one. Maybe you actually kind of do the opposite, and in seeing this list of 4 key points, you see like the one error in there, and it's like, you don't need to make a new thing because actually that error being there reminds you of how important not overlooking that one thing is, right? Like, oh, that I see that list of 4 things, but I don't agree that it's not this thing. Or I would add this 5th thing, and that's something that is so commonly overlooked. This person who made this document made that same error. And so maybe it's not a reason to make a new document. Maybe it's itself a reminder of how significant your extra bullet point is. Okay, so then moving on, this one is an introduction to Especismo. And we see a similar layout to that other one where we have some notice and important and remember. So we're going to actually approach this one out of order and start in the middle, just straight at the question, what is a specific anarchist organization? One, it's a political group that militantly supports popular movements. Two, it's made up of militants with a shared theory and ideology. Three, it's an active minority committed to a common strategy. Four, it's a tool to help create and maintain revolutionary movements. So again, like this list of 4 things answering this question, there's a lot in each one of these. Which means like, yeah, as you kind of understand one, it's meant to be like, okay, how do I combine number 4 with number 2 then, right? And you have to reread number 2. And it's hard to do that if we just have a paragraph. If we just have a dense thing that's explaining theory and giving you, and so the alternative to that ends up being these kinds of like magic bullet like definitions, right? But this is also not doing that. It's presenting a lot of stuff in each one of these four points here, but it's also not exhaustive and it's not oversimplifying. So then looking up to the up here, opposing ideologies. So here's a list of just things that in an introduction to Especificismo, we want to understand Especificismo as being in opposition to. And again, like I talked about at the beginning, this might be a list of stuff to go look into more, right? Maybe one of the things on this list is like, what is that? And it becomes a list of things that like, oh, if I want to understand Especificismo, maybe I need to understand all of these things in order to understand how it's in opposition to them, or at least know what they are. So it can become a kind of checklist of stuff to be learning about, which can be helpful for a group, but also for an individual. So we have opposing ideologies: capitalism, statism, authoritarianism, dogmatism, sexism, racism, nationalism, colonialism, individualism, vanguardism, focalism, and electoralism. So yeah, this could get into like, I can understand the opposition to capitalism and statism and authoritarianism, but what is the significance of opposing electoralism or opposing individualism? Trying to understand why all of these are on the same list is its own exercise, right? Looking into them, but then understanding what do they have to do together that makes an ideology that opposes all of them, not one of them. Notice Especificismo opposes all forms of oppression and exploitation. So again, this is like a thing you can kind of revisit, like we saw before with the remember, notice, and then kind of like, oh, when we read another point to kind of go back to that. We have some bullet points at the beginning here. Introduction to Especificismo, a current of social anarchism developed in a Latin American context, advocating for libertarian socialism, aiming to bring about a social revolution, promoting popular movements in order to transform society, using a specific anarchist organization to foster revolutionary politics. So this is obviously like a list, kind of, again, defining it where each one of these things has a lot in them. And understanding that whole can be difficult if we just wrote out or even said out or had a discussion. So this can be a good way to make sure you're sort of reflecting on the whole of it, all the details. And again, adding in new bullet points. We said before, there's a notice. Especificismo opposes all forms of oppression and exploitation. We also on this one have important. The political level is not the social level. And remember, social revolution will require the liberating politics of unified militants. And then we have 4 points here in between those two, in between the important and remember. So mass movements are the only force capable of bringing about revolutionary transformation in society. Social level is influenced by a variety of political forces. Especialismo is about unifying anarchist militants into a collective political organization. The specific anarchist organization is a method of collaborating with others to defend a political line on the social level. So thinking about ways to use this document, any one of these could be an entire essay, right? Just one of these points is like a whole thing to go look into and research more, to find references for, to respond to find counter arguments to. Every single one of these can kind of become its own thing totally outside of here. And it doesn't need to be in the context of this flyer. It can be the social level is influenced by a variety of political forces. What are these political forces? On a real advanced research level, that can still be like, this can still serve as a guidepost. So both for like, like I said before, it's shareable with beginners, but it's not exhaustive even for revisiting from knowledgeable militants and people who have a lot of experience with revolutionary politics. Okay, and then the last one that we're going to look at here is a strategy for political militants. This one sort of has 3 segments here, and the first segment has three boxes. So strategy for political militants, our first box is methods of struggle. We have 4 listed here. So we've seen in all these documents, there's lots of short lists. This is important because that's what makes them revisitable. You can think about even like, I've been making a lot of comparisons to paragraphs and essays. There's a way of sort of decomposing those, right? Turning a paragraph into a short list, taking the sentence structure out of the list so that it's not reading sentence after sentence. It's the unconjugated verb, or it's just the object that you need to be listing. So number 1, inside. And we have some examples in parentheses after each one of these. So these are different methods of struggle inside, like elections, lobbying, etc. Number 2 is with, negotiations, convincing, reform, etc. Number 3 is against, confrontation, sabotage, etc. And number 4 is outside, experimentation, creativity, prefiguration, etc. So notice all these the list of examples, there's etc. there. This is explicitly saying there's more stuff in here. And by creating this kind of short way of understanding the different methods, we're able to like use the theory expressed here also as a tool. So not just the document becomes the tool, but the theory of keeping these kind of 4 methods distinct from each other in order to understand which one is being used or which one is being maybe explicitly not used. So then the next box here, objectives of struggle. We have A, it's for control of power, or in parentheses for more control of power. A different objective B for a piece of power or a bigger piece of power. C for a reduction in power, and D for an alternative power. So again, we have a short list, and by dividing these up in a way that's referenceable, the theory becomes a tool in addition to the document. So we have methods of struggle, objectives of struggle. Then the last aspect here is duration of struggle. So these are kind of like 3 different characteristics that can be complicated to understand on themselves, reduced to a short list, and then kind of divided up in a visual way that lets us revisit them kind of quickly and efficiently, so that we're not necessarily like needing to take on board the list all the time. We're actually able to take on board more of the thinking, to exercise the reflection, and use the document to hold more of that list. So the durations of struggle, this is short term. Notice we see immediate, medium term, intermediate, and long term future. So similar to what we saw with the pink flyer, and this is where we can kind of start referring back to them very easily with the colors. On the pink flyer, a lot of what that's helping to do is furnish vocabulary that can be used to articulate critiques. So here, what we're doing is furnishing some vocabulary to articulate strategy, not just prescribe strategy, but we can see that short term, another word we can use for that is immediate, right? And so understanding like, oh, okay, I can use those words interchangeably to describe what I'm talking about. The same with like using these words with the methods of struggle. Notice all of those are prepositions: inside, with, against, outside, which means there's an object there. Outside of what? Against whom? With what? With whom? Inside of what? These questions need to be like part of the articulating that into a sentence, but by giving us the vocabulary and the theory behind that vocabulary in a concise way, the theory becomes a lot more useful. So then engaging in the struggle, and here we're going to be kind of defining 3 different ways of engaging and using those boxes to kind of explain the categories. So we have allied support, struggling inside and with the system, and those in power. So notice we're using the words we developed before. The inside, which means like elections, lobbying, etc., with the system and those in power. So inside and with, inside of the system. Like I said before, we have to start filling that in once we start talking about the specifics. For short-term or medium-term gains, not struggling for alternative power in the future. It requires coalitions with bureaucrats and political parties. So maybe, yeah, like we said before, someone might disagree with calling this allied support. Maybe on a terminological level, we could come up with a different way of saying it. But we can see a really dense, elaborated definition of this that needs referencing to these boxes in order to understand how they relate to each other. So these definitions are very theoretical, which again is like not an easy thing to express in paragraphs, because it can be very easy to get lost, and there's a high level of exclusivity or elitism around being able to approach those. The process of reading this definition, scrolling back through the boxes, rereading the definition, like looking just back and forth, that is work that no one can substitute, but that doing it with a document like this is not the same as doing it with a long essay or a really dense philosophical text. So then the next one is solidarity, struggling against power and the system. For short-term gains, determined by necessity, struggling for either immediate control of power or an immediate reduction in power. It requires a lot of effort, commitment, and energy. So even though the last point's there, right, it requires a lot of effort, commitment, and energy. That's obviously like sort of an opinionated statement outside of what's in those 3 boxes. And so that's maybe sort of controversial or polemical, or it might incite a reaction or some discussion. These are not supposed to be the perfect categories. And yet at the same time, by having them be categories, they can even be overcome in an effort to make something better. And so then the last category here, militancy, struggling outside of the system for an alternative power, particularly in the future, struggling for long-term change in society, not struggling for the most immediate needs, not struggling for medium-term benefits, not compromising. So we can see from the 3 different categories how it covers all of the objectives of struggle, all of the duration of struggle, and all of the methods of struggle, but it's differentiating how they're combined. And it's differentiating them, again, in this document about strategy, it's differentiating them in a strategic way. So then the last thing here at the bottom, the conclusions. We have 4 conclusions here. Democrats confuse the methods of struggle and their limitations. Individualists are either against power in general or have unethical objectives of struggle. Political parties mistakenly assume that a short-term victory will develop into a long-term transformation. And revolutionaries must develop theory that allows them to dynamically manage all of these components while not being distracted by less strategic tactics. So one aspect of using a document like this is also about just figuring out all sorts of different people's positionality in relation to your own strategy. It's not about prescribing strategy or a hierarchy of strategy or the perfect strategy. It's about relation of understanding how your strategy might fit with theirs or not. Understanding on what levels it's not the same. And again, that might go back to the pink flyer and like, oh, maybe we're making a strategic critique. What are some ways we could articulate that? Maybe we're making it because we're coming from a libertarian socialist perspective. Maybe the blue flyer could be helpful in like getting some bullet points of like why those things are important for the strategy that's revolutionary instead of just a strategy that's something else. And oh, maybe then we're making a revolutionary critique and we can like get into that with the pink flyer. And it's this circle of using these tools, not because they've already done the work for you, but because they've exactly not done the work in between each other, in between themselves, and that it's clear space that needs to be filled, which means like it's taking this guidepost, but posts are not the trail, right? Posts aren't even the fence, right? And so like the idea that making posts is something that needs to happen, I think is politically very important, in addition to being like pedagogically really important. And for that reason, I think more people need to be prioritizing making these kinds of tools. And specifically educators need to trust the politics behind making non-exhaustive, not perfect, usable tools by real people, instead of being afraid that the most nuanced philosophical arguments will come at you for having made something that's for reflection, that's for learning, that's for critiquing, that's for elaborating on, that there is a different purpose. And we still need to be making those. We can't just like expect them to be idealized already and perfect. So yeah, that's all I have about presenting those. So I'd love to hear any kinds of other ideas y'all had about how maybe some of these could be used, or maybe even some ideas you had about a different flyer you might try to make, or one that you think might be helpful.
I mean, I guess I can go ahead and start because I'm a weird note taker. So, but like, especially whenever you brought up the pink one, like the first thought that really kind of jumped in my head, and I know I've seen them before, obviously, but like the thought that kind of jumped in my head was something I had before, which is like that just having like the sentences to articulate what is meant by stuff like tactical and strategy and, you know, revolutionary and so on. Like, it's just really good because it helps people who might also still need like scaffolding in order to be able to participate, and also just kind of like maybe they need a script to start to build from, to start helping them to like give them a space to extend their political critique, just kind of like, you know, prompt them to go farther with it. And I just like, that was one of the first thoughts that kind of came to my mind as I was kind of staring at that one.
Yeah, I think on the pink one, I think it could also be in that way, like a way of guiding a discussion. Like, okay, let's talk about all of the tactical critiques. Okay, let's move on from the tactical critiques and talk about this next category. And everyone can like, maybe have not like anything's off limits, but like we have to be in charge of deciding what kind of critique are we making, instead of just like, I don't agree, and just wanting to talk it kind of open-endedly, kind of needing to clarify so people can understand your critique. I think that it's actually like, it's not even just helpful to the person making the critique, it's helpful to the people trying to understand it. Heather?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that that was really good. I really like those examples, and I'm going to use them. Daphne and I are in a book club, and I'm thinking when we do chapter 1 next week, I could do something like that for the chapter to get people, to focus and think about how they're understanding the book. And then we're also working on ecofascism and how to get the concepts and ideas of it out there. And so it seems like being able to have something like this is just really brilliant. So I just really appreciate your taking the time to share this, because I'm definitely gonna take it away and make stuff.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that you have plans to make your own, because I think like what can sort of happen with these is like, oh, they seem really helpful, but like it doesn't necessarily become this inspiration to make ones for other things. And I think that it's not enough just like these specific flyers, they're great and like they're really like things you can come back to, but that like, yeah, like making them about a text that you're reading or a topic in order to explore it yourself, but also like with other people. And that kind of made me think about in school, we used to have in French, like literature class, we would like take turns from one class to the next, like whatever we were supposed to read that time. And like one group was supposed to ask questions and the other group was supposed to like be answering the questions. And, as students, we sort of took that as an opportunity to be like, oh, I don't have to read this week because I'm asking the questions, right? Or like, I don't have to look up any words this week because I'm asking questions. So I'll just ask like them to be my dictionary for me. But thinking back, like, and through the study group that we've had in our militant kindergarten, like I see a lot of ways where formulating the questions, just articulating them is actually like a really important task that I think like we can sort of overlook and assume that like, oh, I don't have any questions. And it's like, okay, but can you make any? That's another thing. Because if you can't, I'm not sure that like we're really interacting with the stuff or whether we're just bringing what we already have. And that's why like I think like educators are specifically positioned to do this political task, because I think they understand why there needs to be a textbook that's not perfect. And I don't know, yeah, we can say bad stuff about it every time when we work with it, but we still need to like have something. And if we're gonna get rid of it, we need a new thing. And we have to see that thing as like dead, imperfect, and it's us making stuff about it. It's not it giving it to us.
I have a question about a word that you've used, and I hope I'm not being dishonest here. But you've called these documents dead documents, and you've called textbooks dead. And the way that you've described the interaction with them doesn't seem very dead to me. It actually seems extremely alive and vibrant. And I'm wondering a little bit about why. Like, what do you mean by dead when you refer to this? Is this the finality of the document, the fact that it's not editable anymore? Is that what you call it dead? And if so, could we think of, and is there a need for flyer or curriculum or textbooks that are not dead in this way, that are editable, that are available for learners and for teachers to mess with?
So I'm actually kind of glad you asked that question, because it relates a lot to the theory behind like why something like this is important. And like, yeah, some of it's related to, like you're saying, like the fact that it's finished in a sense. It's not a draft. It's not there to be edited. But a little bit, like I said before, it's not there to be modified or revised or like turned into another thing. And so even in this way of like curriculum or objects that are meant to be like modified in this process, the reason I'm using the kind of word dead to describe the documents is that I think that puts the kind of experience of the documents into the life category. And that puts us having to be doing that. It's an action. It's not there in the thing. So nothing about what we're getting out of the object is the object. Everything is about our action. And what that means is that even when we're going to be modifying some kind of curriculum, that the whole purpose is to like collectively give feedback and it morph over time, that I would almost say we still need like I've used the term also guideposts. That way we can see editions of the thing. We can see lines between them such that they could be compared to each other. And without doing that, I do think we lose a task of like what we've been doing kind of chronologically. Like what we're doing loses a historical aspect. We can a lot of times get really focused on like, well, we need to think about now and now and now, but we also need to think about the historical aspect of now, which means like we need to be able to see how now fits into a context. What came before now? How did we get to now? And that's part of making decisions about how to edit that thing or modify it as it keeps morphing. So I actually think like pedagogically, it's really important to see the objects as dead and to see our task as educators or students or people engaging in learning as being the life part. That way there is no content, like, because content itself is dead. And like it itself needs to be like realized or used or lived in some way. What is learning a thing if you're not like doing something with that learning? I think there's a sort of responsibility put on us by calling the objects dead, because it implies that like we can't blame anything on the flyer. And then there's also like even just on a kind of personal level where it's like, if I personally make one of these things and I expect to be able to use it, not just to like give it away generously, like here's this great thing I made, but if I expect it to be a tool I'm using, I have to think of it as something that's like itself. It has to already be. I can't be sort of like working on it still. And that takes a kind of calling it final in a way that's not just, it's not a draft, but I have to distance me from it. And there's a point to doing that that's more than just like, that's what makes it useful. There's also a kind of needing to, like I said before with the short lists, kind of unburden yourself of those short lists so you can do more thinking about the lists and using the lists instead of like, look at how impressive I am for being able to recall them off the top of my head. That like, maybe that's actually kind of preventing us from doing some deeper thinking. And so some of why you would make one of these and not just use these, but like Heather was saying, like make one for something you're studying is so that like, you don't have to reread all of chapter 1 to kind of reflect on the totality of chapter 1, to reflect on the through line that you're drawing through it. And that like, yeah, that through line might be really distinct and you might be able to make lots of flyers about chapter 1, right? Totally different, unrelated things. And like, that there's a reason to like that exercise, but also to like making them and like having them, because then you can go back and re-encounter them also. Any other questions or ideas? Yeah, definitely.
Yes, I'm sorry. I couldn't come earlier. I had another call, so I missed most of half of the talk, and I realized how important it seems to be. I just wonder if it's going to be if it's being recorded and could it be shared, or is the document can the document be shared too, or is it not really shareable?
Yeah, so we're making a recording, and I think it will be up on the YouTube in
Thanks.
a while. And then yeah, they've put some links into the chat where you can get the documents. They're available on the APN.
Oh, thank you so much.
And yeah, because there are definitely some good things to share around there. One aspect of these flyers is that they're not just this kind of colored thing we can refer to, but they're JPEGs. And so they're very easy to share. A lot of times I find you can't get people to click on a PDF, you know, like they'll be like, oh, that's a whole thing. But if you just send them an image, it can be a whole page size image.
Oh, yes. Okay.
That can really help too.
So yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, if we don't have any other questions, then let's right at an hour. Any last thoughts?
Thank you. This was really important, and it really got me thinking about curriculum in a way that I hadn't. So thank you.
I'm glad to hear it, because yeah, like I said, I've already encountered these flyers so much. It's like, oh, what am I even going to say about them? So I'm glad that they're still furnishing enough that we were able to have this discussion, if nothing else. So yeah, thanks everybody for showing up, and yeah, bye.
Bye.